Welcome to this sermon video filmed in Atwood United Church for the congregations and friends of Trinity United Church in Listowel, Ontario and Atwood United Church. My name is Beth Kerr and I am the minister for these two congregations. In keeping with the masking instructions for this health unit, this video was recorded when the building was not accessible to the public and only members of my household were present, meaning I am not wearing a mask so you can hear me better and see my facial expressions. Our theme today continues our series on spiritual practices for abundant living, even in a pandemic, and focuses on hospitality. Since hospitality is a complicated topic in this time and place with the coronavirus going around, I have imagined how a public health official might respond to today's gospel lesson, and my partner Sarah Brewer has graciously agreed to read the scripture while I offer a public health commentary.
Reading from Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 to 21. When Jesus heard about John, he withdrew into a boat to a deserted place by himself.
Excellent idea, Jesus. The safest place to be during a pandemic is by yourself in a deserted place.
When the crowds learned this, they followed him on foot from the cities. When Jesus arrived and saw a large crowd, he had compassion for them and healed those who were sick.
Now, Jesus, I hope you are healing those people without touching them, and definitely without breathing on them. I heard a story the other day about how you healed someone by breathing on him, and another story where you spit in some mud and put it on someone's eyes. You cannot do that during a pandemic. You must stay at least 6 feet away from everyone who is not in your social circle, and breath and spittle are not to be shared.
That evening, his disciples came and said to him, "This is an isolated place, and it's getting late. Send the crowds away so that they can go into the villages and buy food for themselves."
Yes, send the crowds away for sure. Why did you gather a crowd in the first place?
But Jesus said to them, "There's no need to send them away. You give them something to eat."
No, sharing food with people outside your social circle is not a wise plan. Send them home.
They replied, "We have nothing here except 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish.
Phew, they don't have enough food. They'll have to disperse the crowds.
Jesus said, "Bring them here to me." He ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. He took the 5 loaves of bread and the 2 fish, looked up to heaven, blessed them and broke the loaves apart and gave them to his disciples. Then the disciples gave them to the crowds.
Okay, please tell me that at the very least, all the disciples and every member of the crowd washed their hands or used alcohol-based hand sanitizer before any food was distributed, and that everyone wore masks during the distribution.
Everyone ate until they were full, and they filled 12 baskets with the leftovers. About 5,000 men, plus women and children, had eaten.
Okay, we're going to have to monitor this situation very closely. The maximum allowable size for an outdoor gathering is 100. Everyone who attended Jesus' feeding of the 5,000 is asked to monitor themselves closely for symptoms for the next 2 weeks and get a COVID-19 test immediately if they have even the mildest of symptoms. And if anyone who was at the gathering tests positive, then everyone else will have to social isolate for 2 weeks. I hope you wrote down the names and contact information for everyone should public health need that information for contact tracing.
May God bless to us this story from our faith tradition.
Yeah. When it comes to hospitality, we live in complicated times. Many of our usual instincts towards hospitality are dangerous in the midst of a pandemic. I catch myself multiple times a week having to pull back from doing something that I would have done automatically just a few months ago, like move closer to talk to someone, or shake someone's hand, or invite someone into our home. Hospitality is complicated in these crazy times in which we live, and many of our usual means of reaching out to one another have been thwarted by the need to care for one another by keeping our distance. Our instincts tell us to move closer to one another in times of struggle, but in this case, moving closer is not what we should do. So then how can we offer a hospitable, caring presence in the midst of a pandemic? Obviously, we cannot do what Jesus does in this story from this morning's lectionary. Gathering a large crowd, even outside, is unwise. Sharing food with over 5,000 people is irresponsible. Discovering God's abundance in our midst through the gift of hospitality in 2020 isn't going to look anything like an impromptu, large, giant picnic on a hillside. And yet, I think hospitality is vital to a faithful living, even during a pandemic. It's too easy for physical distance to turn into emotional distance. Since we can only touch members of our own social circle, we become tempted to limit our care to them as well. Yet this is not the way of Jesus. Consider this morning's gospel lesson. Just before the story opens, Jesus has found out that his cousin John has been killed by King Herod. He goes off to a quiet place by himself to think and pray. Yet the crowds follow him, and Jesus is moved by compassion, so he reaches out to them, even though what he most wants in that moment is to be alone. You see, Jesus' first impulse, even in times of struggle, is compassion. Then he feeds them. When the disciples say, "Hey, there isn't enough food, we cannot feed such a crowd in a lonely place," Jesus says, "Find a way." And when the food is shared, abundance is discovered, with 12 baskets of leftovers to prove that there was enough. I think the example of Jesus in this story offers us some clues about how to be hospitable, even in tough times. First of all, genuine hospitality begins with compassion. Compassion for ourselves, compassion for our neighbors, compassion for people we don't even know, compassion for people we will never meet. Honestly, I'm not sure we can ever go wrong by pausing and asking ourselves what a voice of compassion would say in this moment. What would it mean to engage with this situation with hospitality towards self and others? Kristen Neff, in her research on compassion, has suggested that we cannot genuinely be more compassionate towards others than we are towards ourselves. If we judge ourselves for being human, for falling down sometimes, for having needs, for making mistakes, for being vulnerable, then we will subtly judge others for the very same things. However, if we can accept ourselves as we are, full of human grace and human failings, then we are more able to offer an open-hearted welcome to others as well. And I think if there was ever a time to remember to be gentle and hospitable towards the fragile parts of ourselves, well, this is it. This is a tough time for everyone. We are dealing with enormous uncertainty and loss, much of it very subtle, but nevertheless always present. Many of us are tired of feeling like our world is turned upside down. Some of us are coping better than others. Some days are better than others for many of us. And some aspects of this new reality are easier for some people than others. Still, I think for just about everyone, this prolonged upheaval is difficult. You see, human beings are made for relationships, and not just with our immediate household. So physical distancing takes a toll that is hard to measure. And in the midst of all that is fear and vulnerability. Fear for ourselves, fear for our loved ones, fear for the most vulnerable in our communities, fear for the community, fear for the world. So if you are struggling right now, know that you are not alone, and try to be kind to yourself in the midst of it. Hospitality begins with compassion for ourselves. Then, as we embrace hospitality towards others, we also extend that hospitality to those around us, our family, our friends, our co-workers, our neighbors. Many of us are facing dilemmas we never imagined we would face. Does it make sense to send children back to school? Is it safe? What impact will this have on their mental health, their physical health, their growth and learning? How will my choices around education impact my family's finances and overall well-being? We are often making difficult choices between different risk factors. Do I do something that will help my mental well-being, even if there is a little bit of a risk of getting COVID? And how do I really assess how risky something is? And what are the consequences of putting something off, possibly for many months? These can be very hard things to figure out. So let's be hospitable towards one another and extend a generous assumption that most people are doing the best they can. Some people may be making decisions that seem unwise or reckless to us, but we might not have a full appreciation of their situation, or they may not have a full appreciation of the seriousness of the pandemic. Honestly, I cannot imagine very many people actually wanting to be responsible for sparking an outbreak. No one goes out and says, "Yep, I think today I will be the person who starts the North Perth coronavirus spike." It's just not the way we are as human beings. So let's embrace compassion, and let's choose to be kind. Then let us extend our hospitality to those whose life reality is different from our own. Early on in the pandemic, many people were saying that we were all in the same boat. And there is a little truth to that, but it also obscures the reality that our situations are not all the same. We might all be facing the same or similar storms caused by this pandemic, but we are not all in the same boat. Some are riding through the storm in luxury yachts, while others feel like they are on a battleship or they're paddling a canoe. And still others like they are in a dinghy that has a hole in it and they are bailing like crazy all the time just to stay afloat. And when we are busy trying to navigate our own boat safely through a storm, it can be easy to be oblivious to the fact that the conditions on other boats are different for a wide variety of reasons. Reasons like economics, education, race, ethnicity, country of origin, family configuration, sexual identity, and so much more. One of the things that has been reinforced for me this year is that as a white woman, I can be oblivious to many aspects of how racism continues to impact people of color in this country. Because I don't have to deal with it, I don't always see it. For example, this is the first year that I have heard about Emancipation Day. Emancipation Day is the 1st of August every year, and it commemorates the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, of which Canada was a part when that happened in 1834. I had heard stories of Canada as the end of the Underground Railway for slaves that were escaping from the United States. But I don't know that I have ever heard stories of slavery that existed in Canada for almost 200 years before 1834. Hospitality requires us to be open to the reality that different people experience the world very differently depending on their circumstances. I have never been followed in a store because I look Indigenous, but I know that that is a regular occurrence for many First Nations people. I've never been stopped for driving while black, but just about every black person has a story about being pulled over by the police while driving simply because an officer is suspicious that the car that they are driving, their own car, might be stolen. And except during the pandemic, I can cross the border into the United States pretty easily. I have a friend who was born in El Salvador, and he will go way out of his way to find a direct flight to Latin America to avoid having any stopovers in the United States. We both travel on Canadian passports. My parents taught me when I was a kid that if I was lost or needed help, I should look for a police officer. And I have never been rejected for a job in the church because of the color of my skin or the accent with which I speak. But many of my black colleagues in the United Church of Canada cannot say the same. These are marks of privilege. They are not things I have earned. I am not a more valuable human being because I was born white to a middle-class educated parents in a small town in Canada. And hospitality towards my neighbors requires me to stop assuming that everyone experiences the world in the same way that I do. and really listen to the experiences of others, even if that listening is difficult and painful at times, and requires me to work to dismantle the system of racism that allowed slavery to be accepted in the first place. We've come a long way since 1834, but there is also still a lot of work to do. But the good news about hospitality is also reinforced in the story of Jesus. Hospitality creates abundance in situations where at first glance there doesn't seem like there's enough. Jesus and his disciples are in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a huge crowd, and they have only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. There is no way that that is sufficient to feed the crowd. And yet, it is. Jesus takes it, blesses it, and the disciples distribute it, and then they collect the leftovers. And oftentimes lately, I feel like there isn't enough. There isn't enough information to make good decisions. There isn't enough real-life, in-person community. There isn't enough creativity. There isn't enough kindness. There isn't enough courage. There isn't enough willingness to change and grow, and so on. And there is some truth in all of that. It really does feel some days like there are 5,000 people to feed and only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. But that isn't the end of the story. By God's grace throughout history, people have discovered that in the midst of perceived scarcity, when graded with hospitality and by God's grace, abundance is found. Only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish is enough, with leftovers to spare. So let's embrace this week with hospitable hearts. We might be surprised at what abundance we find. Thanks be to God.